Good morning from the shop. Dave here. Welcome back to Not Your Average Airman. There's been a few folks who have expressed some interest in learning and understanding at least how I make my box joints. So I thought I would shoot a little video today and explain a little bit about that. But first, for those who don't know, there are a number of different ways that you can join corners together to make, in my case, boxes. You can do this for um, frames, for pictures, for cabinets, those kinds of things. There's miter joints where you cut 45 in both edges and then you join them. And I use 45-degree miter joints in a variety of boxes, particularly when I have an interesting grain pattern and I want to make it appear as though the wood bends around the corner. And I'll explain how that all works in another video. So there's miter corners, and then there's also box joints. And I use a lot of box joints because in my box making, I like to choose contrasting kinds of wood. This happens to be purple heart and yellow heart, and it makes for a very interesting corner. So I use that quite a bit. So I'm going to explain a little bit about how that works on this box joint jig that I got from Rockler. So once I've decided the different kinds of woods that I want to join together, I go to set up the box joint jig, and I have to decide on whether or not, in this case, I used a 1/4 inch. I've got 3/8 that I use on bigger boxes, and I've also got 1/2 inch in different setups that I use the same jig for, but different elements within that jig. So I'll decide on spacing, and again, it's just kind of a personal preference. I sit there, I'll look at the wood, and I'll say, well, the size of the box, the thickness of the wood, the kinds of wood that I'm using, uh, really determines from a personal perspective what I think is going to look the best. So after I get that done, I'll set my box joint jig on my router table. And then there's a few critical elements. I need to decide, in this case, I'm using a 1/4 inch bit, and I've got some setup blocks. This happens to be a brass setup block that I got. And the first thing I'll do is set the distance between the guide and the router bit. And I have to turn that router bit so that I got the thickest part. So the first setup is just determining what this distance is. And it may seem like it's no big deal. You just slide it in, and if it's close enough, that'll work. Well, I'll tell you that if you're off just a few thousandths of an inch, then what happens is the distances between each one of these, if it's off the 10 or 15 thousandths on the first one, it'll be off twice that on the second one, and each time it grows exponentially the further out you go. So if it's off just the slightest little bit, you'll be off on the whole thing, and you end up having to do it all over again. So uh, I it's really critical that that's off. Now the human hair is between, I don't know, 15 thousandths and 500 thousandths of an inch. So if you're off 500 thousandths of an inch on the first one, you can see how it's going to continue to grow exponentially as you go along. And ultimately what happens is your two pieces of wood don't fit together. So tiny, tiny little adjustments have to be made. And that's why, again, I run my scrap pieces through, which is why, of course, I never throw my scrap pieces away because I'm always using them. So first setup is the distance. The next setup is the depth. And I'll have to unlock this. So this happens to be way too thick. So I unlock it. Then I'll take my adjustment. And the best device that you can use for setting the proper depth is actually your finger. So you want it to just clear that, and I'll explain why. I'll lock it down. You don't want it to be too far off, because these two slide together. The distance in that depth determines how much sticks up. If you got too much sticking up, it's better than not having enough, but that just means that you have to sand that much more off. So setting the proper depth is really critical. So the first piece that you'll run through, and we'll set this on here. First piece that you run through, and I'll use this side as the example. You just set it up against the blue guide, run it through, and that makes your first cut. So using this as a simulation, you can see you cuts the first one, and then you just make the rest of the cuts as you go along, each time advancing it up and over until you're done. The next piece that you're going to run through, because it has to be basically opposite of this, because you've cut the first space a quarter of an inch, in this case a quarter of an inch away, the first one that you run through has to have that first up against that border as a space. So you simply take that, turn it around, put the adjoining piece on, and run that through. And then from there, you can breeze through, make the rest of your cuts on that piece. Then the trick is, and this is where you're just using your test pieces, how well does that fit together? You want it to be tight enough. I can get it through. I know it fit because I just took it apart. You want it to be tight enough that it's a good tight fit. There we go, snaps in. You want it to be a nice tight fit so that there's no space in between those two pieces of adjoining wood on both sides. And then the depth is right. And once that's done, you go to town, you pull your pieces off the bench that you got selected, and make your cuts. So it seems pretty straightforward, but there have been times I have spent as long as 45 minutes going through just adjusting the distance between the router bit and the guide. It has to be so precise, it has to be so exact that it's just got to slide right in. Without a lot of friction, but without a lot of movement either. So in this case, when I got my setup done, I actually got this one done on the first go, which totally amazed me. It amazed me so much that I not only ran one setup piece through there, but I ran the second one through as well, just to be sure. Because the last thing you want to do after having milled your sides for length, and those two opposing sides have to be exact, or they won't be square. The opposing sides have to be exact length and also width, or you won't get a square box. If you don't get a square box, it's hard to make a square bottom, it's hard to make a square top. Simple as that. So it seems pretty straightforward, but again, it's critical to get this stuff done properly so that all these sides come together and you have yourself a nice square box. So that's one example. I'll show you a finished example of a box that I made. This is leopard wood and cherry. And the cherry has a nice figure to it. The leopard wood and the contrast between the dark end grain and the lighter grain, I think really looks beautiful. Finished box. This one happens to have hinges. A lot of them have a top that sets in, and that's what this one's going to have, is a top that sets in. I can get away with that because of the thickness of the wood. And I'll put a nice handle on it. And in this case, there's a slight overhang, just a 64th of an inch of an overhang, so you can lift that easily with your finger. So that's kind of how box joints work. I'd entertain any questions that you have. Just write them in the comments. You guys have a good day. That's all I've got for today. A little bit shorter video, but it explains a little bit about box joints and box joint jigs. This is made by Rockler. The router table is Rockler. The fence is Rockler. I've got a dust collection on the back. That's also all Rockler. Rockler doesn't sponsor this, but I just happen to buy a lot of my stuff from Rockler. I go to the store up in Maplewood. They do really a nice job of helping me out, answering all the questions that I have. And I guess it's kind of maybe it's kind of sad when they almost yell your name out when you walk in the door, because they know here comes Dave, going to buy a bunch more stuff today. So that's it for today. You guys have a good day. God bless y'all, and happy Easter.